Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals on Gran Turismo Sport in particular, and this time we've got a three-way battle, and not necessarily the most obvious of battles, but I've just selected three vehicles from the beta which are not only new to the Gran Turismo franchise, but also which make interesting rivals, direct rivals even, to each other. These are all, of course, European spec GT machines from Renault, Alfa Romeo and Ferrari. So it's Italy v France, the Renault RS1, the Alfa Romeo 4C and the Ferrari 458. All three of these cars have some very particular strong points and perhaps some ways in which they're not quite as good, but generally speaking all three of these are very, very good all-rounders. So the question is, which one will win? Not just in terms of pure lap time, but also once we put them in a top trump style on paper battle. Well, first of all, we'll break down each individual car and then, of course, compare them to find out which one wins. First up then we have the Renault RS1. This car of course shares its engine with the Nissan GTR, which is a pretty good place to start if you're going to make a race car or performance car of any kind, and visually it's certainly a very striking looking machine, it's a very eye-catching car, and it certainly looks the part. It looks purposeful, it looks fast, and if anything it does look like a competitive car. Not necessarily in the colours, which they have it in on GT Sport, but of course with the livery editor we'll be able to change that. So what's it actually like to drive? Well, it's definitely more slippery than something like a GTR, because although it shares some tech with the car, it is still its own machine, very much so. It's a mid-engine car for a start instead of front engine like the GTR of course is, and you can feel that. It's a little bit more temperamental, and potentially, under some circumstances, that mid-engine layout can most definitely serve as an advantage. Generally speaking, not always, but generally, a mid-engine sports car or supercar, or of course by definition race car, can have a very good high-speed flow on corners which allow for that. And the Nordschleife circuit, of course, offers plenty of opportunity for that. On slower corners though, hairpins, 90-degree square corners, that kind of thing, it can be not necessarily a disadvantage, but a car which is a little more twitchy, a little bit more tail happy, and sometimes, on some Gran Turismo games and others too, it can make the car a little bit more temperamental in terms of how you want to set up the machine. And with a mid-engine car you'll often want to have more than one setup depending on the track which you intend to take it on, whereas not necessarily completely, but to some degree a front-engine car can kind of feel at home on most track types. Now the spec on the Renault RS1 is pretty good. It's not class leading in any particular way. It weighs the same as the Alfa Romeo 4C. The power is similar to both of the other cars. It's actually much closer to the Ferrari than it is the Alfa Romeo, so it's pretty well placed. In terms of torque, it actually has the most of the three, which isn't surprising at all given the Nissan GTR power plant, and you can feel the kind of effortless power, to some degree at least, which the GTR engine offers. You don't really have to push the engine as hard as, say, a high-revving Ferrari V8. The engine feels like it's always got the power that you need whenever you need it. The slight disadvantage of that is when you take that engine with all of its power and torque from a front-engine car and then put it into a much smaller, lighter, mid-engine car, it can change the handling considerably, having that much torque and power to deal with. And to be completely honest, you do have to be careful of that on the RS1. Overall though, it's easily a car which can win races for sure, and I have no doubt it's going to be a popular fan favourite when the full game is released not too long from now. What then about the Alfa Romeo? Well, we have covered the Alfa Romeo 4C before. We have yet to cover the Group 4 version, but we have covered this Group 3, and I said before that this may be my personal favourite new car to debut on the beta, and I stand by that. It's a great looking car, it offers something genuinely new for the Alfa Romeo brand on Gran Turismo, and it's a good race car. It stands up well against the much more powerful machines, and although the weight isn't as much of an advantage as you'd probably hope it to be, given how light the car is in its natural form, it still definitely handles itself much better than a large car would be, even if said car weighs the same. As an example of what I'm saying, This car, as I mentioned just now, weighs exactly the same as the Renault, but it doesn't feel the same as the Renault. It feels easily 70 or 80 kilos lighter, and that's good. If the car can have that kind of feel to its steering and also carry its weight in a much smaller package, that's great for twisty circuits. This is easily the most manoeuvrable of the three cars. It's not necessarily the best at higher speed cornering, but for lower end speed, for hairpins, for those tighter corners which I mentioned just now, it's a brilliant machine. City circuits are definitely going to be a place where this car shines, and as I mentioned in its specific review episode a few weeks ago, it's going to be a great beginner's car as well. The kind of race car which can get less experienced drivers into the Group 3 class and get them comfortable with the kind of performance and kind of handling characteristics which you can expect from these cars. What then about probably the most popular of the three, the Ferrari? Well, the 458 GT3 is a very strong all-rounder. It's one of the very few cars on the beta which doesn't really have any downsides. The power is strong, the weight is very good, in fact it's lighter than both of the other two, which is perhaps surprising, and the horsepower per tonne is also the highest of the three, and it's actually one of the highest of the entire Group 3 class so far. But the great thing about the 458 is that, in road form as well actually, this applies, but as a race car it manages to turn great numbers, which plenty of cars have, as all of us know, into actual great performance. And although to some people that may sound like an obvious statement to make, the simple fact is there are plenty of cars with huge engines, massive power, or even low weight, which don't perform as well as they should. Just think of how powerful and torquey the Jay Leno tank car is, but it's one of the slowest cars in the Gran Turismo franchise. This car manages to turn its performance into something great. It's a great all-rounder. Not necessarily quite as beginner-friendly as the 4C, but it's definitely sharper than the Renault. It feels lighter, which it is, and it's just a brilliant all-rounder. It looks good, it sounds good, it's got great handling, and it's fast. So, for me personally, the Ferrari is definitely the strongest of the three, and the Ferrari might even be the best all-round Group 3 car so far, for me personally and for my driving style. But with that being said about all three cars, which one wins on paper? Well, let's find out. Now, as always, of course, with these Gran Turismo Sport beta-based rivals matches, there are a couple of things which we don't know, such as the price. So, you could give no car a point, but as I always do, I'm just going to give them all a point for the sake of it, because I can. As for the class as well, they're all Group 3, so let's give them all a point. It doesn't really mean anything, so we might as well do it anyway. As far as engine size, this is where we start to differentiate between the three. And for that engine capacity, the Ferrari is the clear winner with that 4.5 litre to the 3.8 litre, of course, GTR engine of the Renault, and we're not actually told what the engine in the Alfa Romeo is. I would surmise, based on the way it performs, the kind of torque and power that it has, the way it revs, the way it sounds, and the kind of responsiveness which the engine has, I would not be at all surprised if it was somewhere around a 2 or 3 litre, most likely. But I could well be wrong, who knows. As far as power, again, the Ferrari gets the point, but not by a huge margin. It only has 8 horsepower more than the Renault, but both of them have quite a bit more than the Alfa Romeo. In fact, the Alfa Romeo is one of the least powerful cars of the Group 3 class, which is one of the reasons why I think it's such a great beginner's car, because you've got less power and torque to deal with. And speaking of torque, it's actually not the Ferrari which wins there, but rather the turbo-aspirated Nissan GTR-powered Renault with 485 foot-pounds. Quite a bit more than the Ferrari, but a whole lot more than the Alfa Romeo, almost 100 pound-feet more. Again, the Alfa Romeo has one of the lowest torque figures of the class, which, given the car type, again, isn't too surprising. As far as weight goes, though, as we said already, it does go again in favour of the Ferrari, which is not that much lighter. There's only 5 kilos separating the cars, but the difference is that the Ferrari does feel lighter, but I would say, as I've mentioned before, that the Alfa Romeo easily feels the lightest. But unfortunately, we can't give it a point based on how it feels. We have to base it on the facts, and the fact is, the Ferrari is the lightest. Kind of ironic that the Alfa Romeo and the Renault weigh exactly the same, given how different they are in terms of size and visual style, but there you go. As far as horsepower per tonne, of course the Ferrari gets the point because it's got high power and low weight at 488 horsepower per tonne. The Alfa Romeo, though, is not bad. It's around the middle of the pack as far as the Group 3 machines go. It gives cars like the Aston Vantage and various others still a great run for their money for that number. And the Ferrari, again, doesn't jump a huge amount ahead of the Renault, because the Renault may be behind in both power and weight, but not by much. And, of course, as always, although we don't award a point based on the lap times that the car's got, because there are way too many variables involved, the person driving the car, the tuning applied, of course, the track that you use them on, but it is interesting to note that for me personally, the quickest of the three, kind of ironically, but this does happen quite a lot in these videos, was the Alfa Romeo, which on paper is the weakest of the three, but it was the quickest for me personally. Then it was the Renault, and finally, ironically, the Ferrari. And I say ironically because it actually runs in the exact reverse order of how strong they are on paper. Because for those on-paper numbers, the Ferrari is the strongest with 5 points, then it's the Renault with 3, and then the Alfa Romeo with 2. And even those 2 points are only the 2 points that all three cars get. So if you discount those, in other words, take away the price that we don't know and the class, which is the same anyway, then the Ferrari gets 3 points overall, the Renault gets 1, and the Alfa Romeo gets 0. But in terms of lap time, it's literally the exact opposite. It's the Alfa, then the Renault, then the Ferrari. Interesting how that often is the case in terms of on-paper spec compared to actual performance. So overall, all three cars are fantastic. We've already reviewed 2 out of the 3. The Renault is still to come. And of course, stick around on the channel if you want to hear about that car. But I'll see you guys next week. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.